So yes, I'll come back to, so definitely Sarah's talks, and actually most of the talks previous to this are relevant to what I have to say. So I'll hopefully be building on a lot of that. First, I want to acknowledge that I'm going to be talking about very much team-based work with a bunch of other folks, and also that, you know, we're on the in the Northeast, so definitely not the Pacific Northwest, but we do share a lot of genera and ecological questions and processes with you guys. So hopefully this will be useful. So Acadia is on the coast. For those of you who don't know, Acadia National Park is on the coast. It's mostly islands on the coast of Maine, at the southern edge of the boreal forest. So most of our forests are spruce fir, which I'll come back to a little bit later. Most of this boreal forest south of us is limited to high elevation sites. And in our park, we have this need to restore degraded areas, the areas that were either degraded because of high visitation, trampling, or invasive species. And so you'll also notice that invasive species are definitely threaded throughout how we're thinking about RAD and how we're managing this, using this resist accept direct approach. And so invasive species we've been aggressively managing invasive species, primarily shrubs, over the past 30 years. And we're having to restore these areas in part because to address re-invasion that's happening in these areas. But of course, this is all happening in the context of climate change, and our forests are changing. Already, we've lost 1 out of every 6 of the plant species that were in the park when it was founded about 105 years ago. And of the 10 most common tree species in the park, which you can see here, red spruce actually accounts for about 40% of the individual trees in the park. But out of these 10 tree species, by the end of this century, we expect that 9 out of the 10 of them will either decline or disappear, decline in abundance or disappear entirely based on habitat suitability as the climate warms. So we're expecting really dramatic changes in our forests over the next 80 years or so. And these changes, like I said, we've already seen a bunch of changes in our flora, and these can happen very quickly. So an invasive insect pest that we identified, the red pine scale, which is native to Japan, we identified it here in the park about 6 years ago. And about 3 years after that, basically all of the red pine in Acadia were dead. And so we really don't have any living red pine in the park anymore. And so that these changes can happen really fast, driven by combination of invasive species and climate changes. In this case, drought played a role. And so we're having to think about how to deal with those changes. And typically we might think that what we would see as our boreal forest kind of shifts out of the park, we might see kind of mixed hardwood from further south of us, things like oak and hickory and species like that come in. But we know that those species, as Tom mentioned earlier, they can't, in many cases, they're unable to keep up with the rate of climate change. And we put a lot of obstacles in their way to move. And the species that we know are able to get here are these invasive shrubs. And what we're concerned about is if we're hands off in our management approach as our forests shift, is that we'll see something like what the parks and areas to the south of us are seeing. So these are pictures from a forest health monitoring plot at Morristown National Historic Site in northern New Jersey, but it's typical of most of the national parks just to our south. So this is Japanese barberry here you see in the shrub layer. This photo is from 2009 and then 2013. So just 4 years later, you can see the shrub layer encroaching. And 4 years after that, you can see that it's entirely choked out, regeneration of the forest trees. And so what you would, without management in a forest like this, you'll just see this conversion to an invasive shrubland. And that's what we're concerned that we might see here if we're hands off in our approach to managing. And so we're recognizing that management is urgent, that accepting invasive shrubland is not tenable for us here. Our restoration, we have restoration projects that offer opportunities to test how we might, other approaches to how we might address the transition in the forest, and we're having to address direct more of our science at these issues. And so putting it in kind of an explicit RAD context, you can imagine that our current conditions are these this boreal forest, that in the near future, we're expecting many of those trees to die off. Red spruce notably is drought intolerant, for example, which accounts for that. That's 40% of our trees. So in a good drought and an invasive pest or an insect pest or a disease could really knock it out quite quickly. And so we could resist, which we think is a short-term solution to buy ourselves some time in some cases, or we could accept, which we think would lead to invasive shrubland, or we could direct to try to facilitate transition to healthy kind of mixed hardwood forests that are typical to the south of us. And so what we're doing is we're testing science actions like managed relocation, moving species up. So how might we facilitate movement of those tree species to our south? So this is work being led by Nick Fisichella and colleagues at the Scudic Institute. In Acadia and actually at college campuses throughout Maine, he's set up these raised bed gardens where he's growing plants, trees from the south, as alongside some of our native trees to see what survives, what doesn't survive, what kinds of conditions seem to be limiting, what tree species seem to maybe exhibit traits that suggest that they might become invasive if we transplanted them. So things like black locust that we would definitely want to avoid transplanting or using in managed relocation. We're also looking at actions that might suggest where we might use resist kind of management actions more aggressively. So in climate change refugia, areas of the park that might be cooler and damper for our plants. So you can see a map of some of the climate change refugia. This was done by Jenny Smetzer at Smith College and folks over at USGS. You can see in the purple some areas that are likely to be good climate change refugia for several of our plant species, and in yellow they're less good, and gray they're terrible. But the climate change refugia are mainly on our islands, along our coastal areas, and in our mountains, or at least what we call mountains. I know they're shrimpy compared to your guys' mountains. And we're also testing these in 3 pilot restorations. So we have 3 restorations in different kind of ecosystem types in the park that all were affected by invasive species in different ways and are big challenges for climate change. One's Great Meadow, is our second largest freshwater wetland complex in the park. Another on our summits, which are important climate change refugia, and another at Bass Harbor Marsh, which is the largest salt marsh in the park. And we're testing things about like how we manage the invasive species, how we manage what kinds of species mixes we use in restoration, how we might use managed relocation in the salt marshes, how we might promote inland migration of the salt marshes. And again, this is the idea here, is that we want to use these an experimental approach to these restorations to kind of make our mistakes early, use these opportunities to learn, and really take this adaptive management approach so we can fix things and improve our methods as we go, and make our mistakes early enough that we can undo them as we go. Trying to be smart, knowing that we don't know exactly what the best approach is right now. In terms of thinking about Sarah's talk, we found that communicating our case and approach has been really important, being very transparent. We've invited the press to actually, and members of the community, to some of our internal conversations about how we're thinking about this, how we're making decisions about our management approaches and directing change. And we find that this is really empowering to a lot of people to be focusing. There's definitely a sense of loss in terms of what's changing, but there's also definitely a sense of urgency and focusing on solutions. I think a lot of people really appreciate being engaged in those conversations, which is really important because there's a lot of value judgments, and the community and partners really need to be involved, because in order to get a scale that's appropriate to match the challenge, we really need, making these changes in one national park isn't gonna do what we need to do at the landscape scale. And so this is just to reiterate that we want to keep communicating and involve communities. I think that this is actually at this point probably the place where we have the most work to do, is to really engage everybody that needs to be in these conversations. And just to wrap up, I'll reiterate that I think Gregor mentioned this earlier, where our science symposium on October 19th will feature kind of more about how we're doing resist, accept, direct using this RAD approach here in Acadia, and also a case from Bandelier National Monument. And there will be breakout group discussions as a part of that. So there will be more discussion during that. And there's also, we have an open RFP for the fellowships. Many of our past, these are for early career researchers, and these fellowships are 1 to 2 year fellowships, and many of them are, we encourage RAD projects. Part of the work has to be done in Acadia, but we would definitely welcome proposals that have work both in the Pacific Northwest and Acadia. Multi-park or multi-protected area projects would be very welcome. So anyhow, that's it from here, and look forward to talking more about this as the symposium goes on.